Hi, welcome to my lecture on parasol history and renovation. My name is Rachel Pollock. I am the costume crafts artisan at Playmakers Repertory Company, and I'm an instructor in the costume production MFA program at UNC Chapel Hill. So what makes a parasol a parasol? Why isn't a parasol and an umbrella the same thing? A parasol, if you break it apart, the word means parasol, for the sun. It's a decorative sunshade. Umbrellas are waterproof. And technically speaking, if you want to use correct vocabulary terms, if you use an article as both an umbrella and a parasol, then it's called an en tout cas, which is French for in any case. Let's talk about the history of parasols. The first evidence of them that I could find was in Egypt in the year 3000 BCE. And those first parasols had palm leaves for the cover. They're strictly for the pharaoh, though. So the first time we see them used by regular people, not royalty, you see Greek ladies using them right around the 1st century BCE. And the word they used for these articles is umbraculum. Umbraculum. So you can see the origin of the term that we later use umbrella here with umbraculum. Now it's worth noting that the parasol was independently developed in China as well. And in China, it was invented by a woman whose name is lost to time, but we know she was female, and she invented it right around 200 CE. And these Chinese style of parasols have silk or paper covers and bamboo frames. We'll look at them more in depth in a minute here. Now, in terms of Western fashion history, they don't show up in Europe until the 16th century, when you find them in Italy, and the word that the Italians used for them is umbrellace. So we're getting closer and closer to the word umbrella. Leather or feathers are used as the cover, and they are laid over a wooden hoop for a frame. So it's kind of like a sunshade on a stick. They don't go up and down the way that modern parasols do. Now, Louis XIV popularized the parasol at court in 17th century France. And you don't really see the parasol showing up in England until the late 18th century. So this is all useful information to keep in mind in terms of historical accuracy, but of course in theatrical context, you can always have anachronisms. It's just good to know what type of anachronism it is. And here is an artistic image to show you what those 16th century parasols looked like with the leather or feather covers. And you can see it's really just sort of a panel on a stick. Now let's talk about vocabulary. So if you're wanting to talk about the parts of a parasol, this is a great pair of images to use for reference. So the cover of the parasol is sometimes called the canopy or the cover. Then the shaft of the parasol is the stick on which the canopy is mounted. And at the base, you have a handle, which is functional but can also be decorative. And then over here, this much more detailed image is talking about the different parts of a parasol frame, which all have their own specific names. So starting up here at the top, the spike that sticks out at the top of the parasol is sometimes tipped with a little cap called a ferrule. So the spike and the ferrule. These arms are called the ribs of the parasol. And on the end, the little place where there's a hole for you to stitch the canopy to is called the rib tip. You have stretcher bars here that push the canopy up when you raise it. And this little hinge where the stretcher bar attaches to the rib is called the git, or the middle bit. This runner here that you push to open and close the parasol is kept aloft with this top spring that pops out of the stick when you push it all the way up. And you have another spring down here called the hand spring, which is what you push in to release that slider to run it up and down the stick or the shaft. And then this here is a close-up of the piece that's here in the frame where all of the stretcher bars pivot. And this piece of hardware is called the top notch. So those are the words that I will use to talk about the elements of a parasol frame in the rest of this lecture. Let's consider quickly the Chinese style of parasol, which hasn't really changed too much over time. Parasols that you see in older Chinese art look much the same as parasols that you find today, with their bamboo frames, where they have many complicated thin pieces of bamboo. They typically have paper or silk covers, and as you can see in this design, or in this style, the painting of that cover typically happens after the parasol is completely constructed. And I'm sure you've seen this at, you know, theme parks like Epcot Center and stuff, where you can get a paper parasol painted with your name or a motif that you choose, a blessing in Chinese letters. And that's useful to know from a stage perspective, because you can buy blank Chinese parasols and then paint on the covers yourself. Something architecturally or engineering wise that's worth knowing about these is that the stretcher hinges on these bamboo frames are often created with string, strong sturdy string going through holes that are drilled in these bamboo stretcher bars and ribs. The slider you can see on this one is often carved ornamentally, like with little divots for your fingers. And the spike, you can see over here, often features a fabric ferrule that has been secured to it by string. So this spike does not have a fabric ferrule, and this one does. So 18th to 20th century Western parasols are typically the ones that I have made the most of or interacted with the most in a stage setting. And just tell you a few facts about them. Nearly all canopy shapes and handle lengths can be found in all periods of fashion from 1770 to 1820. So there are prevalent styles in parasol, you know, longer sticks at a certain time, bigger or smaller canopies. But because parasols are very valuable and complicated engineering accessories, you aren't, as a designer, you aren't mandated to only use long sticks in the Edwardian era or only use short parasols in the 1920s. I mean, that is a generalization of something that is the height of fashion, but not everybody is interested in being the height of fashion. So the size of the parasol, though, typically does correspond to the size of the lady's hat and the proportion of the outfit that it matches. So if you typically, designers that I have worked with, they like to have a contrast between a parasol with a large canopy and a tiny hat on the performer. And if the performer is wearing a giant hat, the parasol often is just used more like a walking stick. Closure straps, which I'm sure you're all familiar with because we have them on contemporary umbrellas. The little strap with a snap that keeps it closed. That really doesn't come into use until the end of the 20th century. So typically with parasols earlier than the mid 20th century, they kept them closed. The handspring at the bottom of the stick keeps it closed. It just allows the canopy panels to sort of flutter. If you want more control over that though, a ring on a string is a popular closure to control the fullness of the parasol canopy when it's closed. In the 1930s, you really see the parasol start to go out of fashion. When I'm giving this lecture to a classroom full of students, we have a discussion about why, but I'll just tell you why, and that is the rise in prevalence of the automobile and other means of mass transit like subways and streetcars and city buses. When you jam a whole bunch of people on the subway, a parasol is not a easy thing to have with you. And certainly getting in and out of a car, it's not necessarily something that you want to hang on to. So you do see them occasionally. They have a brief resurgence in the 1950s, but for the most part, you don't really see them in Western European culture. You still see them frequently in the East, but not so much in the US and Europe and so forth. Here's a lovely painting of people trying to cram onto a streetcar and use their parasols because of the open-sided nature of this streetcar and this third-class rail car painting by Charles Rossiter. And this is really just an illustration for these points about parasol etiquette. A man named Thomas Hill, who wrote a lot of etiquette manuals in the 19th century, said that it was a sign of, quote, ill breeding for young ladies to suck on their parasol handles in public places. So it's nice to know that people have always been pretty gross. And you hear a lot more about the flirtation language of hand fans, but parasols had one too. But honestly, I believe that it was a promotional tactic because you find the evidence of what the purported flirtation language of the parasol is as enclosures that were in basically chocolate bars. So it's kind of like if you learn your manners from a Hershey's bar wrapper, then how prevalent is what it's telling you to do? Probably not much, but anyway, talk about this special type of thing. I have an image. There's the carriage parasol, which has a hinged shaft, so it folds to make it easier to negotiate getting in and out of the vehicle. A walking parasol, which has a dome that tilts so that you can, as you perambulate around the park, the sun angle will change and you can change the angle of your parasol dome without having to, swing the whole parasol frame around. And then the Siamese parasol, which features multiple domes on a single shaft. And I'm calling it a Siamese parasol because it's primarily developed in Old Siam and Bali for their royalty in the 17th century CE. I'll show you a picture of what that type of parasol, well, all three of these look like. So this is a carriage parasol that on the left, it is fully open and the stick extends behind it. And then on the right, the hinge has been activated and it is folding. It's not completely folded, it's folded out a little bit so that you can see how that works. These types of parasol frames, you can find them sometimes on eBay. They often go for fairly expensive. And because they are so tiny, designers really like them because they're cute little accessories, and actors really like them because they can fiddle with them a lot. They can do a lot of business with a carriage parasol. So that's just worth knowing. I have one of these in the collection at Playmakers Repertory Company that I have recovered a couple of times. This is a contemporary version of a walking parasol because I couldn't find a period illustration of this, but if you see that, unlike the carriage parasol where the hinge is at the base of where the once you put the canopy down, the hinge is past the edge of the closed canopy. In this case, the hinge is up here at the top of the shaft so that you can adjust the angle of the canopy while you have the stick held stationary. And then this on the left is the Siamese parasol, which I'm sure you've seen this. I've seen it at, like, you know, I feel like I've seen it at Disneyland parades and such. I've seen them with 2 domes and with 3 domes like this one pictured. And on the right here is an image that I put it in here, not because it actually is a Siamese parasol, but when I searched on that phrase, this image came up, and I assume that it is like a kind of a offensive joke at the expense of conjoined twins, because this parasol has, or this umbrella, parasol, whatever, has 2 canopies that are conjoined down the middle. And I found this frame really interesting because I can see something here that spans between one and the other. So I'd love to see how this folds up when it goes, when you put the canopy down. But anyway, that's just a digression. Let's talk about patterning the parasol, because the canopy of the parasol is essentially just a triangle, but it's not. And I'll talk about a few ways that you can get that parasol pattern piece. And the first is drafting using math and geometry. If you are drafting minded, then that's a great way to do it. But many people find draping more easier to wrap their head around than drafting, and you can drape it using a method called foil and string, which I'll show you an example of how that works. Or if you're lucky enough to have a previous cover, even if it's shattered, even if it's wrecked, if you can isolate one panel of that cover and restore the straight of grain, because it will be extremely distorted from the pressure and tension of the parasol frame, if you can restore that straight of grain, then you could just trace the previous cover as if you can restore one piece, even if it's got giant holes and tears in it, to trace a pattern off of. So use whichever method makes the most sense to you, because all 3 of these methods will make beautiful parasols. I've been teaching parasol restoration for the past 14 years, and all of my students have employed various ones of these, whichever ones made sense. And so far, I've only had 2 folks not get the result that they wanted. And it was not because of the patterning, it was because of the fabric choice, which I'll talk about fabrics options here in a minute. So if you're a drafting minded person and you want to start with a triangle, the frame of the parasol determines the dimensions of what that triangle is. So you measure your length of your rib, and then you count the number of parasols and get a protractor. So if you have 6-panel frame, you need 6 triangles for your parasol cover. Then you divide 360 by 6, And you make your triangle with 2 legs that are the length of the rib, with the angle in between, that 60-degree angle. But that's just your sloper to start with, because if you cut that out just as is with that triangle, you'll get this super flat, unsophisticated, this strange, it's strange looking parasol because there's no curvature to the canopy, which a designer might love that, but it doesn't really look like what we think of a parasol or an umbrella looking like. And so over here on the right, you see an image of what happens when you lessen the distance between the 2 rib tips across the bottom, just a bit. And when you curve that in, you want to grade it back up into the panel into the angle that you have at the top. So you only are changing the triangle pattern, curving it in the bottom third. Because if you change it too much in the vicinity of those spreader bars, you can create a parasol that just won't open. Like, it has to have enough distance for those spreader bars to fully extend the frame. But you'll be safe if you just stick to the bottom third of the triangle. Now, this is an illustration of the string and foil method, which this is a former student of mine, and she has an antique frame that had no canopy on it, and she was very draping minded. And I asked her to take this picture just as an illustration for this. She's threaded this very strong string through the holes in the rib tips all the way around and pulled it down to get the type of curvature that she wanted in the dome, which in this case, she wanted extreme curvature. Now, notice that she's wearing safety glasses or safety goggles because your eye cannot perceive the depth perception of a parasol frame without a canopy on it as it moves, and you really will poke yourself in the eye. Now, I say over here, you need an assistant for this because you got to exert a lot of force to get this level of curvature into a frame, and somebody needs to be down here holding the base of the stick for you. That person should have on goggles, and so should you, so that nobody loses an eye, because that's when it's not fun, right? And you can, because these are threaded through here, you can very easily vary the panel widths and the dome shapes using this method. So let's say that you wanted, well, I'll show you an example in a minute here of one where you have a skinny triangle and a wide triangle, and a skinny triangle and a wide triangle all the way around. It's very easy to do that with this. So once you have it in this, once you have the shape that you want and the distribution of the panel widths, how you'd like it, then you use aluminum foil and just press it over here to take a print off of the panel. And that becomes, you trace that on paper, true it up, that becomes your parasol panel piece. Now let's look at variations in canopy shapes. You can alter the lengths of the ribs to get different parametric shapes, and I'll show you a photograph of what I'm talking about there. The more ribs that a frame has, the more circular the finished parasol will appear, and the smaller each pie slice piece will need to be. You can alter the shapes of the panels to get different dome shapes, and you can extend or vary the shape of the bottom edge along the parasol panel to get interesting variations as well. And let's look at some pictures of those. This is one where the rib tip length, or the rib length, has been varied. So if you imagine this is a Chinese parasol with a paper frame or a paper canopy. If you imagine it could be a circle that goes all the way around from the longest tips of this sort of star shape that it's become. But they've cut down these ribs in graduated lengths to create this multi-pointed star, which is, I love the effect that they've got out of this. You could also use this technique to create a square parasol shape or other polygon shapes. This is the one that has the different panel widths. And so it has this visual effect of kind of like an iron cross or something, with the black and the white, but you have this big wide panel here, and then these very narrow 3 little panels in the white in between. So this is another technique that you can use to create squares and other polygons, or just add visual interest to the parasol itself. Pagoda shape is one that is frequently very popular with students that I teach. And in order to get the pagoda shape, you have to split and spread the upper part of your triangle to elongate it so that you have this little extension that can get pushed up. You really need to have a parasol frame that's got a long spike on it to create the parasol shape, because when you put the parasol down, this slides down to the base of the spike, and it only pushes up when you raise the frame because there's a spring inside of there. So if you imagine this spike where the ribs come out, where that top notch is right here. Okay, the ribs are not creating this onion dome shape. The ribs are just creating the lower part of the curvature. The pagoda comes from the canopy and the spring inside that pushes it up when it's raised. Here's an example of what happens if you add a decorative edge to the bottom of the parasol panel. This is a wave shape, but you could curve it down like this, or make a point that then would sort of hang down like a awning has. So that's just a fun design option. Talk about waterproofing, because even if you're making a parasol, perhaps it's an outdoor performance and you want it to be able to be waterproof in case it rains. And recall that a waterproof cover is what makes a parasol into an umbrella. The Chinese paper parasols or silk parasols, they use oil or waxed paper to make them waterproof, the oiled silk or the waxed paper. In the 17th century, recollect that they were using leather and feathers, which naturally shed water. And in the Victorian era, they took a page from the Chinese and were oiling the silk cover fabrics, because oil resists water. So like if you've ever shaken up salad dressing 20 million times, you know that putting oil on that fabric will cause the water to run off. And contemporary waterproof fabrics that you buy from mostly outdoor fabric suppliers, the technical term for that is Gloria. And Gloria describes the fact that it's waterproof. You could have polyester or nylon Gloria. You could have silk or cotton Gloria. It refers to the treatment that has been done. Now, what sort of fabric you choose can influence what sort of design you have. You want to use natural fibers if at all possible, and the reason why is because synthetics can squeak against the frame as you put it up and down, which is undesirable in a stage context. So you want to look for cotton, silk, linen, blend, really cotton and silk are my preferred choices. And whether, sure, it can be a solid, fine, but if you choose stripes, border prints, or large motifs, you can do really interesting things with the orientation of how you cut those panels. Let's look at some images of what happens. So if you have a stripe and you cut that panel on vertical so that the stripes go up and down, then you get this really interesting sort of asterisk look to the top of your canopy, and it chevrons up the ribs where the seams happen. If you orient it so the stripes are going horizontally and parallel to the base of your pattern, then you wind up with a polygon of however many ribs your parasol frame has is the shape that you get. So these are both 8-panel parasols, and so you get an octagon, but I've done this with a 6-panel parasol, get a hexagon, done this with a 10-panel parasol and get a decagon. But know that you're going to get this sort of radiating shapes when you have those horizontal orientations. If you have a border print, where you choose to cut it on that border can yield a really interesting look to the parasol canopy, depending on where you choose to center your panel. And this is an excellent example. One of my students did this some years ago, of taking a large repeat that has an interesting motif and cutting your panel so that if you're always lining it up, so that if you look, this is the center of her panel, lining it up so that you have, let's say you're going to put that green dot in the absolute center. Then if you are good about matching your seams up the sides, which she just aced it on this, you get this kaleidoscopic effect that's really, really impressive. Let's talk about trim and ornamentation. There are things you can do to the frame, like you could replace or cover the spike and ferrule with ornamental finials, like that you would find in a hardware store in the lamp section. You can use applique or creatively piece the fabrics from which you cut your dome panel pieces. You can apply fringe, braid, and other trims before or after you sew that canopy together. And you could add a carrying loop or an ornamental tassel at the handle. A lot of surviving extant parasols from prior centuries have a carrying loop and a tassel still surviving on the frame. So here is a couple of panels in which applique has occurred. And in this case, they did cut work with Battenberg lace, which I suspect that they did that before they stitched the canopy together. I can't think of why you would want to deal with it after you've sewn it together. But in this case, I think they did the applique after the canopy was put together, just because it crosses the border between 2 panels. I mean, they might have sewn that seam up the center, done the applique, and then sewn this together in 4 double panel pieces. But I just like looking at things and thinking about the order of operations in which they occurred. This is an example of creative piecing, where, like, this is an image from a Threads magazine article on making your own umbrella covers, where they were illustrating how, if you're familiar with strip piecing as a quilting technique, then this will make perfect sense to you, where you sew together stripes of fabric and then you cut panels out of them. And then this is one that one of my students did a few years ago, where she also had a loop to close it, a ring on a string. And she pieced these fabrics into kind cut them into strips, pieced it into yardage, and then used that to cut the panels out. And it's worth knowing, if you're going to piece together these, if you just leave one of the seams open, like in this parasol, or umbrella actually, this seam is not fully sewn. And that allows it to be windproof, because there is it's like when you see slits that are cut in the netting at a tennis court. Around the court, you'll see like little smile shapes cut, is a way to let the wind come through, so it doesn't just, in the case of a parasol, blow it inside out. Let's talk about linings. You don't have to line a parasol, certainly. Most of them, in fact, aren't lined, but it's an element of, it's an opportunity for design, and it's an opportunity for opulence, because lining a parasol is essentially making two canopies and putting them on the same frame. If it's going to be a sleek lining, you can use the same pattern as for the canopy cover. But if you want it to be a gathered lining, then you can split and spread that triangle to add more fullness into it. Consider your lining color carefully, because if it's darker than the cover fabric, then it can bleed through from the outside. So if you have a white batiste parasol and you line it in bright red, then you're actually going to look like you have a pink batiste parasol, because you'll see that red through the white. Of course, actually, before I move on from that, you should also consider the complexion of the person who's carrying the parasol, because it can reflect on the color of the fabric, can reflect on their face. You know, so someone that looks beautiful carrying a green parasol with a pink lining is going to maybe look kind of dead with a parasol that is pink parasol with a green lining. This is just my philosophy, that your lining should complement the cover fabric. Such as, if the cover is a printed fabric, like one of those kaleidoscope designs, and you want to line it, then a solid lining helps keep it visually comprehensible and not too busy. You can also use the contrast between the lining and the exterior as an element of visual interest on stage. So if you have a scene where people are in mourning, they're at a funeral, and there's a widow all in black, and she's got a parasol closed as they're standing there at the gravesite or whatever, and then everyone leaves and she opens the parasol and the inside of it is hot pink, then, you know, maybe she's not so sad that her husband just died. It could just be an interesting element of surprise. You need to tack your lining to the ribs and make sure that you leave ease around the hinged sections of the ribs, the gits and the stretcher bars, because you don't want that lining to get caught up in the mechanism of the parasol frame. It needs to function. That's the primary, because if you give an actor a parasol, they're going to want to open it. Okay, this is an interesting picture of something that I call kind of a lining technique on the Chinese parasol style, where with the bamboo frame, because the string is used to create the pivot points, some artisans have used really complex sort of string art opportunities to use that functional element to create visual interest and design. I just loved how these strings are necessary to make this go up and down, but they've turned it into such a design feature on the inside of this parasol. This, I got this image off of an eBay seller based in India, and I loved how they have created parasol with such ornate ornamentation. and not just the exterior, the lining is just as interesting. And when I teach this class to people in person, we spend some time looking at this slide to try to determine what was put together, what was put on these panels before they were stitched together, and what trim was top applied. Like, I think this rosette here was top applied after the whole canopy was put together, and definitely this rosette on the inside because it goes over stitch boundaries. But then the ornamentation here that goes around in sort of a polygon shape, I think was put on before they sewed it together because it breaks at an angle every time there's a seam. You can repair a broken frame, and I'll tell you, I buy all my parasol frames off of eBay, and it's a personal policy that I never pay more than $25. So I will buy completely broken antique frames and repair them because you can. And you can actually do it fairly easily because the nature of umbrellas hasn't really changed that much. You can probably find something in your stock or in a thrift store or along the street during a rainstorm that you can harvest parts from in order to repair the ones that are broken. If your stretcher bars are bent, you can epoxy a new part in there because the stretcher bars are, cross-section of a stretcher bar is a U shape of metal. And so you can bend it back into place and just epoxy a new part, a strip of stretcher bar into the channel of the broken one to reinforce it. Heavy floral wire is great if you need to attach a new stretcher to a rib, or if you need to replace a rib and then put the whole thing back together. Heavy floral wire has worked well for me. And if you've got a paper parasol with a bamboo frame and there's a hole torn in it, you can patch that using basically paper mache techniques, you know, tear a patch and adhere it from the inside using white glue, bend out white glue, and it will fix your paper parasol. So that's the end of my presentation. Here are some folks whose knowledge and experience has contributed to my assembling this presentation. I've had folks in my graduate students ever since 2007 who have made all kinds of beautiful parasols, and we've discovered all kinds of new stuff about how to restore them together. So I thank every student who I've ever had in that class. Tristan Bass and Lynn Taylor Sievers of the Greater Bay Area Costumers Guild provided me with some handouts from a parasol workshop that they sponsored many years ago, because I wrote a book on parasol restoration because I couldn't find anything written down anywhere about how to do it. And so thanks to Tristan and Lynn for the initial resource of that handout. Thanks to Marjorie Dorfman, who is an umbrella historian and a writer. Joan Kiplinger, who wrote that article, or wrote an article for fabrics.net about parasols. Natasha Stoller, historian. Denise Wallace-Briggs, who's the crafts artisan at the Huntington Theater, and the first person that I ever worked with that I saw take a parasol apart and restore it. Check out my book on lulu.com and please subscribe to my channel. If you'd like to leave a tip, there's a PayPal link in the masthead graphic and on the channel About page. Thank you for watching my content.